Chapter 6 of Letters from Mrs Palmerstone to her daughter, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Ball, or the History of Miss Crosby. It must always be a matter of serious regret to me, my Eliza, to find any occasion of mixing with that advice and instruction in which I have both pleasure and comfort, admonitions painful to you. But you are of an age fully to understand that in no one instance of my maternal cares can I give you more undeniable proofs of my affection and solicitude for your happiness than by those reprehensions which place before you the errors and faults of your youth and inconsiderateness. You asked me a few days since, with an air in which I perceived much more of petulant anger and vexation than of friendly concern, if I could guess at the cause of Miss Fernhead's strange behaviour, for that for some days she had refused to walk with or visit you as usual, that when you had accidentally met her she was reserved and cold in her manner, and, as you thought, stately. I answered your question by observing that I had never seen the smallest indications of a capricious temper in Miss Fernhead, that I had observed, on the contrary, uniform kindness and striking proofs of her attachment to you, and that I therefore recommended to your consideration to seek in your own conduct rather than in hers for the reason of her apparent coldness and estrangement. You were silent, and I flattered myself that I had said all that was necessary, but I was mistaken. Yesterday morning I renewed the subject by asking you what had been the result of the inquiry which I had recommended relative to Miss Fernhead. You blushed, but it was with resentment, and you replied with a disdainful toss of your head that you knew of nothing which you had done to offend Miss Fernhead, that she did perfectly right to please herself on a point which you were in no wise inclined to dispute, for that her studied neglect was unanswerable. Were you aware, my child, at that moment, that your mother's assistance was necessary in order to enable you to analyse those thoughts which too rapidly escaped your own judgment? Were you aware that you were yielding up to your angry passions your reason and even the convictions of your conscience? Is it not true that you discovered by one glance into your mind that self-examination would infallibly bring self-accusation? You shrunk from this trial, preferring on the weakest ground to be angry with your friend, rather than on the most solid to be dissatisfied with yourself. But, my Eliza, this poor evasion will not do. Something still admonishes you that all is not as it ought to be, and I warn you that you will be restless and uneasy until that friendly monitor is content. I will add my voice to its faithful suggestions, and I will tell you a plain truth. By your present conduct you are unjust to yourself as well as to Miss Fernhead. You are colouring a mistake of youthful inexperience and heedlessness with the tints of ingratitude and sullen ill-humour. I am confident, from my knowledge of the natural integrity of your mind and the ingenuous simplicity of your nature, that this charge will very sensibly wound you, and possibly you may be strongly tempted to doubt of my penetration and to accuse my justice. But this subterfuge will not last. Like all impositions which cheat us under the semblance of truth, the honest and simple will soon detect the borrowed garb, and the fallacy concealed under it. You will soon return to that docility of spirit and to that influence in which you know you are secure. You will trust a mother with those interests and that happiness which are dearer to her than her own life. Let us then dispassionately call before us all the circumstances which immediately preceded Miss Fernhead's change of behaviour. Let us endeavour to discover the real motives which have produced a conduct so unexpected and so much resented by you. You were permitted on your birthday to invite your own guests. The charge of receiving them and entertaining them devolved on you. I was one of those guests, and I conditioned for no duty beyond that of enforcing your orders, if necessary, with servants whose pleasure it is to oblige you. I was not dissatisfied with your little embarrassments on receiving your visitors as they respectively entered the drawing-room. I know that the native modesty of youth requires time and habitual practice to fashion the manners to that ease and elegance of deportment which distinguish a polite and well-bred woman. Your timidity, although in some degree awkward, was accompanied by civility and good-will. Your attention was general and courteous, and your bashfulness disappeared with the first ceremonies. I saw with pleasure every face dressed in smiles, and every eye sparkling with delight. The formal circle was broken, and in huddled and joyful groups you consulted together about what should be the amusement of the evening. Cards were unanimously rejected, and all with complacence listened to your proposal of showing them a game with maps and geographical cards. The door opened, and the servant announced the two Miss Nashes. In an instant you disappeared, in order to meet them in the antechamber, and you returned to your other deserted guests with more animated pleasure, and hanging fondly on the arms of the strangers. Instead of introducing them to those young people who didn't know them, and of this number was your long-selected friend Miss Fernhead, you sought a vacant corner of the apartment and placed yourself between your new favourites, apparently forgetful that any besides yourselves occupied any other part of it. Engaged by your whispering and tittering companions, it entirely escaped your observation that you had imposed silence on the rest of the company, that they had reassumed their seats, and in awkward constraint waited for your recollection of them. Some, from good sense and disapprobation of your behaviour, shrunk into reserve. Others, repressed by the supercilious looks of the newly arrived visitors, and by your neglect, felt uneasy and looked abashed. In this unpleasant suspension of all entertainment and social pleasure, your friend Isabella was fruitlessly essaying by her looks to recall you to yourself and to your duty, and with admirable address endeavouring at the same time to divert the attention of the young ladies from too close an observation of the impropriety of your conduct. The pianoforte was opened, the music turned over. No one chose to play or to sing. Miss Fernhead lost her time and her patience. She now approached you. "I believe, my dear Eliza," said she, "that your friends are waiting for you. Can I fetch the cards which you mentioned, or will you?" With careless indifference you replied, "They're in the dressing-room. The servant will find them on the table." One of your Miss Nashes prevented more by whispering in your ear, with her eyes fixed on the sweet though disturbed countenance of Isabella. Your answer implied the question, and distinctly reached my ear. "A good sort of a girl, very good-natured, a neighbour." Miss Fernhead, close at my side, looked down, retired instantly, and mixed with the other young people. To this good sort of a girl, to this neighbour of no account, was Miss Palmerston indebted for all the exertions of good breeding and good sense in which she herself was so deficient. Her gaiety enlivened the remainder of the evening. A spirit of retaliation arose in the breast of some, and in others the desire of amusement, and with the happy expedient of drawing the profiles of half the company from the shadow, Miss Fernhead succeeded in making them perfectly indifferent to the donor of the feast, and unmindful of her partial adoption. When left to ourselves, you asked your friend how she liked the Miss Nashes. "I do not know them," answered she gravely. Without observing the air or the tone with which this reply was made, You expatiated warmly on the wonderful merits of these young ladies, their beauty, their air of fashion, and above all their wit. They were lively beyond expression. No comments were made. We retired with your kissing your friend and saying that she looked tired. The next morning I did that which you ought to have done. I thanked Miss Fernhead for her delicate and kind consideration, marked your omissions, and did not forget your rudeness to her, and your inattention to her good offices, engaging that the time was not distant when you would most sensibly feel and acknowledge your fault. I am, madam, said this sweet and amiable girl, perfectly convinced that it will be as you say. Eliza had no intention to offend me, and I should blush to be offended by a behaviour which I confess vexed me. I wished to have prevented this, not presuming on my better knowledge, but as being her friend. I am 2 years older than Eliza. It's not surprising that I am somewhat more sedate. My friend, added she, smiling, was absent. It was my duty to supply her place. I believe you will expect to hear after this that it was I who prescribed the conduct which Miss Fernhead has since observed, for Miss Palmerston is not yet returned. We will now, in order to prepare for this return, inquire into the pretensions of the ladies who have thus allured you from yourself and your former friend. In this inquiry we will silently pass over the indecorum of any marked preference of guests in your own house and at your own table, where neither rank nor influence can claim an exclusive right to any beyond the established rules of precedency. We will confine ourselves simply to the question of what is their title to your particular favour and notice anywhere. I think you met these young ladies twice or thrice at Sir George Fairfield's in Cornwall, whilst we were with Lady W., and you have seen them as often since their being in town. You wished to show them some civilities, and you were right, as they form a part of your general acquaintance, and as they are known to some of our friends. Have you a precise idea of what your grandfather means when with an ironical air he talks of pretty misses? I think you would in an hour have discovered in these girls 2 of them, if you had fully comprehended his sarcastic appellation. Do you find in them any of those qualities which attract his approving smiles? Do you find any of that amiableness at which we have seen him melt into tears as it brought to his recollection that of his deceased son, your father? You have indeed, my child, been strangely misled. We will now endeavour to assimilate your new favourites with Isabella. But the opposition in their characters renders this no easy task, for where shall we look for any resemblance between the unassuming and mild virtues of Miss Fernhead and the pertness and conceit of the Miss Nashes? In fact, they have not one feature in common. They would shrink from a competition with her, even for external advantages, and, silly as they are, they would feel too sensibly her superiority to enter the lists on the score of mental endowments. We have, however, only one more step to make before we shall detect the latent cause which has for a time seduced you into a forgetfulness of those principles which you have been taught to consider as the only sure guides in your adoption of friends and companions. We shall find this cause in the poor and changeling offspring of the human mind, vanity. This childish and craving inmate of the heart, which reason laughs at, and could by a steady look awe to annihilation, and to which, nevertheless, she so frequently and so abjectly yields up her power and submits her authority. Yes, my Eliza, your vanity has disgraced your understanding. You accompanied Lady W. to Sir George Fairfield's in an elegant carriage adorned with a coronet, and attended by 2 servants. Your dress and appearance, and, if you will include mine, did not disgrace this equipage. The Miss Nashes were in ecstasy with Miss Palmerston, her London fashions, and her new dancing steps, but they did not forget themselves in their admiration of you. They talked of their papa's park, their mamma's jewels, and an Irish peer who was their first cousin. Thus was laid the first foundation of your mutual partiality. In London you perceived these girls affecting all the airs of importance which folly annexes to the title of heiresses, overlooking to-day those whom they had acknowledged the day before, confidently and haughtily pretending to and assuming place and distinction with their equals, insolently intimidating the meek and the modest by their rude and contemptuous looks, and marked indifference to all but the selected favourite of the hour. Have I charged these traits too strongly? I refer you to the ball at Mr. Fortescue's, and I cheerfully rest my candour on the judgment you will pass. You were, however, their idol that evening, and very much elated by the distinction. I was sorry for it, because I was certain that you were preparing for yourself a mortification to which you had hitherto been a stranger. You were persuaded that the decided preference of the showy and lively Miss Nashes gave you consequence in the eyes of your friends, and I was diverted by observing the air of protection you assumed with 1 or 2 of those whom you wished to partake of your good fortune. You copied the tone and manner of your favourites, became fatigued when they chose to be tired, were negligent in the dance, and could never find a seat but at their side. You succeeded, though awkwardly, in your part, and entirely forgot that Miss Palmerston in a hackney coach, or in a front box, with odd-looking people, that is to say, with her best and dearest friends, would be an absolute stranger in the eyes of the fashionable Miss Nashes. But I will not rest my predictions on improbable events. Your friends may possibly escape the appellation of odd-looking, and you may not approach them in so humble a vehicle as a hackney coach, but the event is not the less certain. The first time they meet a better-dressed girl, or one introduced with more éclat of rank and fashion, the charming Miss Palmerston will be nobody, and should it happen that she presses upon their recollection by civility and accustomed familiarity, they will, without the smallest difficulty, teach her to understand that rudeness is not very remote from insult. For this experiment have you hazarded the loss of a faithful friend, one who has known and loved you for more than 3 years, one who has shared your innocent pleasure and casual pains, one just to your merits and indulgent to your faults. In a word, one who does you honour, unportioned and unallied as she is, by her attachment to you. For she acknowledges worth only, and coldly rejects the claims of pride and caprice. She knows, young as she is, that friendship and mutual confidence must have for their basis a virtuous mind, a steadiness of character, and an affectionate temper. She respects herself, and will not stoop to the affectation of follies that she despises, or court the favour of those whom she can neither esteem nor trust. But she has a heart that will forgive inconsiderate error. It is still open to you. To be the cherished inmate of it, you have only to forget your Miss Nashes, and be again yourself. The following incident in the life of your favourite Mrs. Fermor will exhibit, I trust, most powerfully the advantages resulting from a sincere and virtuous choice in early friendships. It may not be inapplicable to the present occasion. At all events, It will serve to convince you that it is in your own power to render yourself worthy of the friend whom you have offended. You have so frequently seen the amiable Mrs. Fermor that it is needless to expatiate on her character. You will admit without hesitation the general, I may say the universal opinion, which pronounces her to be one of the politest women in London, and to this her friends will add that she is equally estimable for the virtues of her mind. But I believe it is reserved for me to inform you that in early life, with all the endowments of her mind and the graces of her person, she was in the utmost danger of sinking into one of your grandfather's pretty misses. I must, however, prelude my little narrative with the leading incidents in the life of Miss Crosby, the friend of Miss Clarendon, now Mrs. Fermor. Miss Crosby lost her mother when she was an infant. Her family connections took no share in an event that deprived her of the first of human blessings. Mrs. Crosby had highly offended her family by a marriage which they regarded as disgraceful to her friends and ruinous to herself. This lady, when young, was an orphan and heiress to a considerable estate. Her father, who was the last surviving parent, having left her and her large fortune to the care of an old gentleman, whose habitual parsimony and exact honesty were his best recommendations to so important a trust. His love of money and aversion to expense entered into his plans relative to his ward, and he was perfectly satisfied with a conduct which had for its principle the most scrupulous attention to the savings of a long minority. He lived in a very retired way at N, and his young charge, with a housekeeper and 3 servants, composed his household. The young lady's family paid little attention to arrangements which had in a great measure removed her from their sphere of action. They censured her father's will, and forgot the means by which they could have rectified what was principally defective in it. At a very early age, this young and inexperienced girl became acquainted with Mr. Crosby, the son of the keeper of the county jail. He was nephew to her guardian's housekeeper, and frequently visited an aunt who loved and was proud of him. This was not without reason, for to a remarkably fine person he joined a conduct which had gained him the good opinion of all who knew him. His father, whose only child he was, had exerted his utmost abilities in his education, and he was at this period clerk to an eminent attorney at N. It does not appear what share the aunt had in the intrigue, but it is certain that in 2 months after the lady became of age it finished by a clandestine marriage, and the consequence was a formal renunciation of her by her family connections. The young couple retired to a distant part of the country and resided in a handsome house on Mrs. Crosby's estate. It will not be seeking too remotely for causes if we attribute the rapid decline of Mrs. Crosby's health after her marriage to the uneasiness of her mind. She happily discovered qualities in the husband which, it may be presumed, had been very little heeded in the choice of the lover. Mr. Crosby was a sensible, worthy man, and with unremitting affection and tenderness he cherished the woman whom his heart had selected with more eagerness than his interest had sought her fortune. She discovered every day that he was worthy of the notice and favour of her relations, and with an anxiety which augmented with this conviction, she solicited a reconciliation. Mr. Crosby entered into these sentiments not only as they corresponded with his own honest purposes in respect to his wife's settlement, but as they appeared so intimately connected with her tranquillity. But the undisguised and unrestrained resentment that appeared in the haughty answers to their repeated solicitations convinced them that it was in vain to hope for any reconciliation. Mr. Crosby was told that he was a villain, his wife the victim of his artifices, the dupe of her own folly, and an alien from their blood. Mrs. Crosby felt with bitterness and indignation this outrage on the honour of her husband, and forgot that by her infringement of those obligations due to the established laws of society, she had furnished to the intemperate anger of her family an apology which would meet with general acceptance, if not a complete justification. Her death left Miss Crosbie an infant 3 years old, and a husband inconsolable. He considered his wife as having been in reality the victim of her attachment to him, and with unfeigned sorrow lamented an affection so fatal to their common happiness. Mr. Crosbie wanted not spirit to encounter the contempt of his wife's family, and after her decease he declined all occasions of recalling them to his remembrance. Occupied with his Emma and cares for her welfare, he became more and more recluse, but his retirement excluded not the respect of his neighbours, nor attention to the wants of the poor. When his darling child had reached her 6th year, he wisely considered her danger under his fond indulgence, and he determined to place her in the hands of a lady 20 miles from him, who had for many years sustained a very high reputation at the head of a school not less numerous than respectable. This lady, whose name was Sandford, was deserving of the confidence of the anxious parent. She entered with the tenderest interest into the good Mr. Crosbie's views and the peculiar situation of his child. Emma Crosbie was about 14 when I became a boarder with Mrs. Sandford. She had always been considered as the child as well as the pupil of this excellent lady, and I found that I had been much favoured by being the first young lady with whom she had slept, for she had till my arrival shared her governess's room. This preference arose perhaps from my mother's having met Mrs. Sandford during her summer vacation at the house of a friend. Struck by the manners and attainments of her pupil, she then resolved on leaving me with Mrs. Sandford during her expected absence from England. She mentioned her intentions, and added some unfeigned commendations of Emma. Mrs. Sandford related the history of her mother, spoke with concern of the dejected father, and finished with affectionate praise of dear Emma. Miss Crosbie and myself, during this time, had with all the facility of youthful and artless nature become very fond of each other, and our intimate union at school confirmed this good will and produced a friendship which time and experience have sanctioned. In a few months after my arrival and settlement, Miss Clarendon came, and was lodged in our chamber. She was of my age, and somewhat younger than Emma, of a noble and ancient family, and had lived with her great-uncle from her infancy at a beautiful seat in the neighbourhood of S., the place of Mrs. Sandford's residence. With a very considerable fortune which she inherited from her mother, she was also the acknowledged heiress of Winford Castle and its rich domains. She was a fine, showy girl, high-spirited, impatient of contradiction, disdainful in her deportment, and prompt in her resentments. To balance these defects, she possessed unequalled gaiety and generosity, with a careless good humour which was never averse to mirth or sport. My friend Emma shrunk from her advances to familiarity and confidence. Her quiet and gentle spirit met with timidity the proffered friendship of the heiress of Winford Castle. I was as lively as Miss Clarendon, and delighted in the society of a girl who animated everything within her reach. Emma insensibly became easy and unconstrained with her, and we shared in common our little pleasures and our little mortifications. The yearly ball now drew near. Miss Clarendon, the most expensively dressed girl in the house, and who appeared to consider this distinction as an undeniable prerogative, expected Mrs. Sutton, her uncle's housekeeper, in order to settle that important article, her attire for the occasion. Mrs. Sandford not being judged competent to such a care by the zealous Mrs. Sutton, whose long services and attachment to Miss Clarendon had been productive of considerable influence in the family, and had in fact changed her original station to that of an inmate of the drawing-room when it was without other guests. Mrs. Sutton arrived a few days before the ball, in a coach filled with bandboxes. A new and costly silk robe was displayed to our admiring eyes. Silver fringe and tassels decorated it most splendidly. To this superb dress were added white and silver shoes, and a London cap of silver gauze, ornamented with silver flowers. Mrs. Sandford had most undoubtedly shown a very different taste in Emma's equipments, for a muslin frock and a bunch of roses for her head completed the preparations made for her. It was customary for those friends of our governess or of the young ladies who did not wish to participate in the pleasure or fatigue of the ball to assemble in her drawing-room in order to see the ladies when prepared for it, and as we finished our toilet we repaired thither to receive their good-natured smiles of approbation and some marks of kindness, which we pocketed. No one in the house had been judged capable of dressing the heiress of Winford Castle by Mrs. Sutton but herself. She had been indulged with a particular room for this purpose, and Miss Clarendon had passed in review before Emma and myself were ready, and had been conducted by the triumphant and exulting Mrs. Sutton to her uncle, who was seated in great state at the head of the ball-room, ready to receive her. When we entered the drawing-room, Mr. Crosbie met his daughter. He surveyed with melancholy attention her light and elegant person, took her tenderly by the hand, gazed on her face, and sighed profoundly. Then, rising with ill-concealed agitation, he placed round her neck a gold chain, to which was suspended her mother's picture set round with brilliants, and once more looking at her with undefinable emotions, he burst into tears and suddenly quitted the room. This affecting scene retarded us for some time. Poor Emma wept bitterly, and was long in composing her fluttered spirits, till soothed by Mrs. Sandford, and encouraged by all around her. We at length entered the ball-room. The girls crowded about us on our appearing, curious to learn the cause of our delay, but this curiosity instantly yielded to the admiration that Emma's new ornament excited. Miss Clarendon, who had till then enjoyed without a competitor all the honours resulting from her finery, approached us to make the same inquiries which had been forgotten by the girls, who were now engaged in remarking the striking likeness of Emma to the picture. Miss Clarendon was called upon in a moment to confirm this opinion and to admire Miss Crosbie's elegant decoration. Her face flushed with rage. All the violence and pride of her ungoverned mind burst forth, and with the most insolent disdain in her manner and the most bitter irony of tone, she remarked that Mr. Crosbie had omitted the most essential part of his gift. "Had the keys of the prison," added she, sarcastically smiling, "been hung to the chains, we should at once have recognised the granddaughter of the gaoler at N." The insulted Emma, still agitated by her interview with her father, turned as pale as death, and was sinking to the floor quite insensible. Speedy assistance was given, and she was conveyed from the room. You will easily imagine the confusion this occasioned. Emma's sudden indisposition prevented the principal figure dance. Every girl who had witnessed the scene and knew the cause of Miss Crosbie's illness cautiously shunned Miss Clarendon, lest they should be mistaken for her abettors or defenders. The task of the evening closed, and I was dismissed with the rest to my repose. Weary, dejected, and very angry, I prepared to step into bed without speaking or looking at Miss Clarendon, but not before I had silently observed that Emma's place was vacant. My heart palpitated with resentment. I didn't dare to give utterance to my voice, or the upbraidings that I wished Miss Clarendon to hear. At length I perceived she made no advances to join me, and pushing back the side curtain to cast one indignant look at her, I found she was sitting by the bedside exactly in the same state in which she had entered the room. My heart, Eliza, was hardened against her, and I thought she was sullen. "You did well," said I with a toss, "to disencumber yourself of your finery in the dressing-room, as you intend to pass the night in that chair. I conclude," added I with unpitying accent, that such is your design?" "Oh, no matter where I pass it," exclaimed she, casting herself on her knees and hiding her face in the bedclothes. "No matter what becomes of me," pursued she, "I hate myself. Everyone hates me. Oh, they must hate me, for God himself hates the proud of heart." My resentment softened in a moment. Soothings instead of reproaches now engaged my thoughts. We passed the night in plans to reinstate her in the favour of Mrs. Sandford, and to gain forgiveness from the gentle Emma. "I know not," said Miss Clarendon, "what apology I can make, but there is none that I shall think too humiliating. Shall I confess the truth, and plead that for an excuse, which will disgrace my understanding as much as I have exposed my bad and headstrong temper? But indeed, my dear Angelica, so it was. I was certainly influenced by Sutton's conversation. I think that I should not otherwise have been so cruel. But she expressed her surprise that Mrs. Sandford had found no other apartment for me than Miss Crosby's. She thought, she said, that every one should have their proper place, and that whatever Mrs. Sandford might think of her pet, the granddaughter of the N. gaoler, could not find hers with the heiress of Winford Castle. But your uncle shall know it," continued she, reddening with anger. "If anything can prevail upon him to send you beyond his daily reach, this will. And London is the proper place in which to find you education and proper associates. However," said she, settling my robe, "they will see the difference to-night at least." I have, my dear Angelica, heard too many of these conversations. I am neither so childish nor so silly as not to see this woman's motives, for she consults only her own interest. But I have not been wise enough to despise them. And to-night, but why do I talk of it? I can never be forgiven." 3 whole days passed, and we saw not Emma. She was ill. On the 4th she took her place in the schoolroom with placid cheerfulness, met the greetings of her companions with kindness and gratitude, and in passing me pressed my hand and whispered, "Thank you, do not forsake her." She neither shunned nor sought Miss Clarendon, spoke occasionally to her with polite reserve, and appeared the same meek and unoffending Emma. She still continued to sleep in Mrs. Sandford's apartment, and I diligently sought an opportunity of expressing to her how much this separation grieved me. "All will be well," answered she, the tears running down her pale cheek. "All will be as it ought to be, my dear friend, in a few days. I am not permitted to tell Miss Clarendon that I pity her. My governess did not choose I should answer her letter, but I think you may assure her that you know I still love her. She has injured herself, not me. There's no cause for my ceasing to love her, for I am proud of my alliance with integrity and humanity. I am proud of being the grandchild of that man of whom even the meek and benevolent Howard would have said, 'Behold the friend of the miserable. Respect the man who communicates comforts to his fellow-man in a prison, and beguiles the sad hours of captivity and chains of their burden.' Miss Clarendon knew him not. She thought only of the obscurity and meanness of his condition in life, and in a moment of heedless folly forgot the lessons of Mrs. Sandford, who constantly inculcates that it is not the post allotted to us, but the diligent discharge of the duties annexed to it, which stamps us with honour. Comfort her, my dear Angelica, and instruct her, for she has a noble mind." This injunction I faithfully observed. To say the truth, Miss Clarendon stood in need of consolation. I do not believe that the severest corporeal punishment or the most humiliating mortification would have produced on Miss Clarendon's mind half the pain that it endured from the suspense in which she was kept. Not a word escaped any of the teachers that had any reference to the ball. Every indication of curiosity on the subject on the part of the young ladies was repressed, and various were our comments on this inexplicable silence. Some of the girls attributed it to the influence of the heiress with Mrs. Sandford. Others, with more probability and candour, to that of the gentle ascendancy of Emma, whilst the greater part had ceased to interest themselves in an affair from which they had only experienced a slight privation of amusement. Mrs. Sandford had not spoken on the subject to Miss Clarendon any further than telling her that Miss Crosbie would shortly answer the letter which she had sent her. The irritable temper of this poor girl, and the continual vexation in which she was, manifested themselves in her countenance. She looked pale, and lost her appetite. On the Sunday evening we assembled as usual for the purpose of its peculiar duties. 14 days had nearly elapsed since the unfortunate ball. At the conclusion of the prayers, Mrs. Sandford said with dignity and calmness, "Young ladies, there now remains for me a duty which has not been forgotten, although suspended in order to render it in its performance more impressive and salutary." She paused. Never shall I forget, my Eliza, what passed in my mind at that instant. Although perfectly free from blame, I felt like a criminal before his judge, and with downcast eyes and beating heart supported the trembling Miss Clarendon. "The offence," continued Mrs. Sandford, "on which I have the painful office of animadverting, was a public one, and my reprehension of it must be public also. But, my dear children, look not at this moment for the offender amongst you. The most sincere repentance and the most generous avowal of the affront have cancelled Miss Clarendon's fault in the memory of her who suffered from it. Miss Clarendon is once more entitled to that place in our hearts which she so heedlessly and intemperately hazarded by yielding to the suggestions of a ruling passion. She will, I doubt not, permit me to use her name as the vehicle of those truths which I now wish to impress on your minds. She will tell you that she has experienced in all the bitterness of such a conviction that in insulting the feelings of a fellow creature you plunge a poniard into your own breast. She will tell you that pride and arrogance defeat, and always will defeat, their own purpose, and that neither rank, nor fortune, nor beauty, nor talents can cover the deformity of the heart in which pride and envy and malice have their dire abode. But she will say yet more. She will tell you that her repentant tears have been sweet, that a healing balm has diffused itself in the wounds inflicted by self-reproach, since she has banished these enemies of human peace and of human honour. She will tell you that from the hour in which she acknowledged herself the slave of passion and nobly cast off the debasing power, she has recovered her self-esteem, and that she looks forward to a completer triumph. Nor will she be disappointed. The proselyte of truth is doubly dear to us all." She extended her arms to the weeping girl with emotions that she did not affect to conceal. "Oh, this is," said she, "an hour of victory indeed. Oh, may it for ever expel from the hearts of my children these cruel invaders. Oh, but," added she, sweetly smiling, "I forget my Emma. She has a right which I withhold. Let me restore to her her beloved Miss Clarendon." The girls were in an instant locked in each other's arms, whilst I, with wild joy, was clinging to Mrs. Sandford, incapable of speaking my love and gratitude. Mrs. Sandford now with collected seriousness addressed her pupils. "You ought," said she, "to know the real value of those distinctions which so tenaciously influence human opinions and direct human pursuits. I am not called upon to inquire either into the origin, the utility, or the reasonableness of pre-eminence in rank and power and wealth. It is sufficient for my purpose that such distinctions have always existed in social life, and under some form or other will exist so long as man associates with man. We ought, as common members of it, to respect the common and established laws of the society in which we live, and those who support, by a conduct conformable to their elevation, their claims to respect, ought to receive it. But they who trust to external honours for consideration will do well to look into their feeble tenure. This will afford nothing on which pride can erect its absurd pretensions. They will find the trophies of their greatness mixed with base alloy, that they have been borne by those who have tarnished and soiled them, and that they have been disgraced by vice and obscured by poverty. Miss Crosby's grandfather was the keeper of a common prison, and content with his humble condition, he honourably and conscientiously performed the duties of it. Miss Clarendon's paternal grandfather had to support the dignities of a long train of noble ancestors. His profusion and licentious indulgences disgraced them and brought ruin and want on himself. He was arrested for debts which his vices had led him to incur, and confined for a considerable time in N gaol, and to the humanity of its keeper was he indebted for the comforts of his prison and the decent supply of his daily necessities. Let this example teach you all the folly and presumption of looking back to your ancestors for that honour which must result from your own conduct, or for any apology for supercilious contempt of those whom you imagine to be your inferiors. For be assured that this contempt will infallibly revert on yourselves. Remember, it is your own virtue and your own wisdom that must ennoble you. The mockery of ceremonial usages, the forms of respect which power and overgrown wealth exact, you will find of easy price. Few are disposed to dispute for straws. But expect no homage from the heart, nor any deference from the understanding. These are not imposed upon with gewgaws. They will have merit, or they will laugh at your pretensions. To these observations, continued the good Mrs. Sandford, I have only one decision to add, which by its solemn importance supersedes all the deductions of human reason and experience, whilst it confirms their inferences. You know that the great and powerful being has declared that pride was not made for man. We were dismissed, and the remainder of the evening was given to extraordinary indulgence and joy, and to crown all, our Emma retired to the same bedroom with ourselves. The effects of this incident were not transient. From this hour Miss Clarendon looked up to Emma as her model. No persuasions could induce her to leave Mrs. Sandford's house. The ascendancy which this sweet girl acquired was indeed surprising. The approbation of Emma Crosby was the recompense of every effort of self-command. She read in her modest and retiring eye the signal for wisdom and forbearance. The sound of Emma's voice modulated her rising notes of petulance, and her smile of approbation appeared necessary to her well-being. I was one day remarking these things to her. "I do not," replied she, "wish to disown what you say. Emma Crosby is the object of my emulation. I love you, my dear Angelica, but with that sentiment I find mixed a reverence for Emma, which I cannot well explain. Do you know, she was perfectly acquainted with the circumstance mentioned by Mrs. Sandford relative to my grandfather. Do you not see with what encouraging gentleness she manages my headstrong temper? Has she not convinced me that the humble of heart are blessed?" When these young ladies quitted Mrs. Sandford, their friendship had taken that form which it will retain as long as they exist. Winford Castle and Mr. Crosby's house had alternately their guests until the marriage of Miss Crosby took place. She has been many years the wife of a gentleman recommended to her favour by her mother's relations, who are proud of a woman that reflects honour on them. Mr. Crosby met with dignified good nature the overtures of reconciliation made by his wife's connections, and with a candidness which marks his character, observed, in reply to the concessions made him, that he was an example of those evils so commonly attendant on youthful and indiscreet attachments, and which almost always lie concealed in unequal unions. I wanted not," added he, "either probity or affection, but I wanted that firmness of mind which ought to have left me no alternatives in a decision in which the honourableness of my own principles and the delicacy and the reputation of the woman whom I loved were so deeply implicated. I married her, and incurred the opprobrium which it cast on my name. But, inexperienced and guiltless as she was, she saw not the justice of this harsh opinion. She felt my injuries, and slowly, but heaven be praised, not repentantly, acknowledged that the woman who, unmindful of her station in life, quits the rank allotted her for one very much beneath her, has no right to complain if, on wishing to return to the post she has deserted, she finds no admittance. In becoming the husband of the rich Emma Wentworth, my character was open at least to suspicion. As the father and guardian of her child, it has, I trust, exhibited its native rectitude. The sorrows which have been left me with this precious deposit have silenced resentment. I meet with cordiality the hearts of those who are disposed to love and protect my child. To her I leave the enforcement of claims now so happily admitted. She will not disgrace her family." The amiable Miss Crosby, on her marriage, went to Ireland. Her father has constantly resided with her. Mrs. Fermor, having no family to engage her time, visits her friend annually. She says that nothing can draw Emma from her father and nursery, and that if I wish to see her, I must seek her in the midst of 5 rosy-faced boys and girls in the apartment of her father, who is very infirm with the gout, but whose cheerfulness appears to increase in proportion with his rising comforts. His son-in-law is worthy of that title, and deserving of the wife which heaven has bestowed on him. Mrs. Fermor speaks in raptures of a little Emma, whom she calls her own. "For," said she archly, "although she has stolen the dove-like eyes of her mother, she has something of my former glorious spirit, and now rules her grandfather at her will, who, I fear, if he takes no care of what he is doing, will prepare her for those lessons to which I have been indebted for my comfort and happiness. My amiable Emma still remembers me, and frequently writes. She reproaches my indolence, and bids me make my peace by presenting you. I trust I shall one day exultingly see her embrace the deserving object of my care, and receive from her those congratulations that will communicate the purest joy to the heart of your Angelica Palmerston." End of Chapter 6. End of the Letters of Mrs. Palmerston to her Daughter, Volume 1, by Rachel Hunter. Read by Anne Fletcher.